Hello and welcome to my FlossTube channel. I'm Jeanfarish and I am just so happy to be here sharing what I know and what I love about counted cross stitch and other related counted thread techniques. So I'm going to start with showing just kind of a fun little video I made when I was packing up the kits for my little class I'm going to be teaching at Stitchin, Kitten in Irmo, South Carolina in November. And it's just sort of a sort of a little treat. I decided to box up the kit supplies and just kind of make it kind of special. If you're interested in taking the class, which is a scissor fob, it has pre-stitching. The class instruction is focused on learning the linen finishing stitch. And so to register, just call the shop and I'll put the contact information in the episode description. Last week, I mentioned that during a Zoom gathering sponsored by Salem Stitches, a question came up about how I get sort of the faded or just kind of the soft, worn look in the hair in the basket verse. And I explained to the gathering that night that I cut lengths of the flower thread, which is what I use for stitching that sampler, and then just did them from like dark to medium to light, back to medium, back to dark, and then to medium, which basically gives the same look as an over-dyed floss without having to get an over-dyed floss. And this will work with any assortment of shades of the same color. And I think that the best results are probably when you have 3, 4, or 5 shades that are really, really close together. So let me show you what I'm going to demonstrate with tonight. So, of course, I'm using Cosmo Floss because that's my favorite. And these are 5 shades of the same family. And you can see where, when you put them all together, it's a very, very subtle change in the color. At least I think the light's on there so that you can see. And what I would do, I might take the lightest one out and just, whoops, I'm making all kinds of noise here, and use these 4. The important thing is, as I'm stitching, I'm going to go dark, medium, light, pale, and then back up in the other direction. So after I do the pale, I'll go to the light, the medium, and the dark. And when I get to the dark again, I go back in the other direction. That's going to give you the most subtle color change between the threads. Now, I didn't plan this out. I cut a length. This is 10 inches of the darkest color, and I'm gonna stitch with 2 strands. So I'm gonna actually have 5 inches in my needle. I really don't know how many back stitches I'm gonna get with that. Not very many, and that's okay because I want to show you how it's going to work. And as always, I dampen my floss with water that get all those little curls out of it. And I find that that is all I need to do to prepare my floss. I am not a fan of beeswax or any other kind of conditioner on floss unless you're working with metals when you're doing gold work. So since I'm going to stitch with 2 strands, I can start my back stitch with a loop start. And I'm just going to make a random back stitching here. And since I'm stitching on linen, I'm stitching over 2 strands. There's my loop. Just going to go right through that loop. And that's what I call a welcome knot. I want that knot there. So I really don't know how many stitches I'm going to get out of this 10-inch length, 5 inches in my needle, but I think it's going to be sufficient. You know, that's a really short length for a cross stitcher. And if you are one who is adverse to threading your needle, then it's probably a technique that you're going to want to avoid. Now, when I'm stitching my back stitching, I'm trying to make each stitch about the same size. So when I'm on the diagonal, even if I have 2 diagonal stitches in a row, I'm not going over the 2 squares at once. If you're stitching on Aida, that would be 2 Aida squares. On linen, it's 4 linen threads. But I'm doing this so that each stitch is about the same size. And I think it gives you the best looking back stitch that way. I'm not obviously following any chart here. I'm just meandering. So just like on the diagonal, if I have a straight line that's covering 4 squares, I don't take 1 gigantic stitch over the 4 squares. If I have a straight line along 4 squares on my chart, I don't take 1 gigantic stitch along those 4 squares. Instead, I do 4 stitches. If I'm stitching over 1, ooh, I hadn't thought about that. I can't imagine stitching back stitch over 1. I don't do a lot of over 1 stitching. Now, I don't want to go too far without, before ending my thread. You'll also notice I'm not paying a whole lot of attention to how the thread is twisting, because when I'm doing back stitch, I don't think it really matters a whole lot. So at this point, I'm going to bury my thread on the back. And burying your thread in back stitch is very different than burying it in cross stitch. I kind of weave back and forth like this. And I probably err on the side of burying it, over burying it, if that's a possibility. I don't even know if that's a word. Because I just don't want to take a chance of it coming out. So that's the darkest color. Now I'm going to thread up 10 inches in the next color and see how that does. A lot of people confuse the running stitch or the long stitch with back stitch, and they really are 3 completely different stitches. We call this one the back stitch because you'll notice that although the line I am stitching is going toward the right, each stitch motion is actually going to the left. That's why we call it the back stitch. I think of it sort of like the swimming stroke called the backstroke. Any other stroke, it's just not the same. When I'm back stitching, I like to do the sewing motion as much as possible. So if I have a run of several stitches in a row that it's in a straight line, I like to just do the sewing motion. I think I get the best looking stitches that way, but that might just be a figment of my imagination. I don't know. But I think one more and I'm going to end this thread. I think on the back you can see the color change is a little bit more dramatic because there's a whole lot more thread on the back. And by the way, when I end my thread, notice how I'm going back and forth like this. I'm not going over. I think that adds an unnecessary lumpiness on the back. And if that isn't a concern of yours, then don't worry about it. But I just try to avoid that. Now, the stitches on the back are twice as long as the stitches on the front. So that's another reason why I'm erring on the side of really an extreme. So I'm not going to continue with all 4 colors here, but you can see how there's just a very subtle change from one color to the next. And if I just kept going, I would have the look of like a very softly worn or over dyed thread. So anyway, that's just a good way to get that sort of antique look with your back stitching. And as I said last week, it would also work stitching really any part, you know, an alphabet, anything that is continuous color. Just, you know, one more tool for your tool belt. Oh, and by the way, I counted the first 10 inches, now 5 inches of my needle, 10 inches cut. I got 17 stitches out of that. So that just kind of gives you an idea. I think 10 inches is kind of extreme. That's a lot of threading needles, but it would give me the most, you know, the most subtle change, I guess. I don't know. I guess it really wouldn't make a whole lot of difference, but anyway, I just thought I would share that with you. Also, let me say this about starting and ending your strands for back stitching. If I've got a dense area of cross stitching close by, I don't hesitate to anchor my back stitching in the back of the existing cross stitches. Especially if I'm stitching with one strand. And of course, a lot of back stitching directions call for one strand. And so that, you know, the loop method obviously doesn't work with one strand. So the waist knot is one of the ways to go. And I like using what I call an away waist knot. Now, it's not going to work with that really short length that I had. And that's when you leave a knot quite a distance, like 5 or 6 inches away from your stitching. Start stitching. When you're done, clip off the waist knot, rethread that thread end into your needle, and then bury the beginning after you've done the stitching. So that's just a little tip that, you know, might serve you well. I've been thinking a lot about the whole idea of learning new stuff, whether it's learning to stitch over one, whether it's learning to stitch on linen, whether it's learning to stitch on even weave, how to do a new stitch. And, you know, anything like that is navigating a new road. And that road can be full of twists and turns. And if it's a landscape that you're not familiar with, road signs that you're not familiar with, sometimes the road signs in a foreign language, mileage in kilometers instead of miles, speed limits in a different language, all these things. My metaphor can go on and on and on here. But if you have good teacher, good instructions, good diagrams, that's like having a really good map, or having that GPS and that voice that tells you, you know, in 0.3 of a mile, turn left, your destination's on the right. So you also have a scout to warn you of hurdles that are ahead. Man, I love history, and I studied history in college, taught history, and so I just always have this love of our connections to the past. And I think about those people who were first, you know, crossing the prairies, crossing the mountains to move all their belongings and their kids and their pets and their cow. And if you didn't have a scout, you wouldn't know where the mountain pass was. You wouldn't know the best place to ford a river. And the first time I saw the Grand Canyon, I thought, man, what if you were like going along and you suddenly come to this big hole in the ground and realize you can't get to the other side? That's when a good scout would be handy. So having a teacher who can give you advice and can say, one of the things to watch out for is, or one of the tendencies of a new stitcher is to do such and such, and this is why that's not a good idea. But even when you don't have an in-person teacher, there are good instructions out there. There are good stitch diagrams. Everything that I have learned so that I can teach someone else, I've taught myself by reading directions, by looking at stitch diagrams. And if it's something that's completely new to me, I'll find several sources and kind of, you know, look at it as like 3 different points of view. And if they all are saying the same thing, then I know I'm going in the right direction. So the thing that I want to share with you, and especially, I have a birthday coming up, and that always makes me start thinking about aging and how I don't feel my years. I still think of myself as being decades younger than I really am. But I'm really making an effort to keep my mind sharp. And every expert that I read says the same thing. Learning something new, taking up a new hobby. It can be learning to play a new instrument, learning to play a game. I shared a year or so ago that I started to learn to play bridge because I love to play cards, and I just know that learning something, going into something where I have no knowledge whatsoever, and in fact had some habits to break because I grew up playing pinochle. And if you play pinochle and bridge, you know that the bidding system and the rules of play are very, very different. Anyway, what all these experts say is that that's a way to keep your mind sharp. So yes, you need to keep your body healthy. You need to take those walks. You need to eat well. You need to get good sleep. But you also need to keep your mind sharp. And that's a reason to sometimes stretch a little and try something that you don't know how to do. Try something that seems hard to you. Because the thing is, when you overcome those obstacles, you feel so good about it. And there is nothing that compares to that feeling. So as you're learning something new, every twist, every turn, every obstacle is an opportunity for you to figure out a solution, for you to develop some resilience, to, just that good old-fashioned stick-to-itiveness, and just saying, I'm not going to give up. These non-linear paths can be the most interesting parts of our day. The other thing that all these experts say is, especially as you age, is to be careful not to spend too much time alone. And cross-stitch, of course, is a solitary hobby. There's no doubt about it. And that's why I've been talking a lot about finding groups of people that you can stitch with, whether it's on Zoom, whether it's at your local library. And don't wait for somebody to invite you. Pick out a coffee shop, pick out, again, a library, and go take your stitching. Get comfortable and just sit there and stitch and see what happens. People might come over to you and say, what are you doing? Can you show me? Oh, that's interesting. Oh, I used to do that. These are opportunities for conversations. And who knows, you might just meet your best friend. So learn something new. Take your stitching outside the house and find a way of combining the love you have already for this craft and a passion for excellence and the need to be with people, and mix all those up together and see if you don't end up with a stitching group. It might be a group of 2 or 3. That's plenty. You don't have to, success is not measured by numbers in this quest. It's measured by the connection you have with the other people and how you feel about yourself and how you get a chance to get to know other people that you would have never come across if you didn't just take your stitching one day and go to the public library and find a comfortable seat and start stitching. And if you do that, let me know how it turns out. I would love to hear from you. So wherever you are, wherever you're stitching, I hope you stitch happy and stay safe. I'll see you next week. Once again, I forgot to ask you to subscribe and to hit that little bell icon so you always get reminders. Just because I forgot doesn't mean you should.